believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Brands, also known as Ricky Brands, and a great episode for you today. Today we have researcher, thinker, writer, author, philosopher, Matthew Ehret. And we had a absolutely amazing conversation. These are my type of guests and my type of conversations I enjoy the most. The type of shows where we talk about everything and anything. We go down roads we didn't think we were going to go down and discuss and share and challenge ideas. It was absolutely tons of fun. I hope you guys enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed having it. So let's get through this intro fairly quickly so we can get right to the conversation. Of course, as always, I'll remind you guys, this is a Value for Value show. If you get some value out of these conversations, and I know you do because so many of you hit me up and tell me that you're enjoying my work, you're enjoying the conversations, or you connected with a specific episode or guest. So please, if you do get some value out of these conversations and these podcasts, consider giving some value back. It doesn't have to be financial. I know many of us are dealing with some tough financial times. So consider just taking a little bit of time out of your day to share, review, rate, subscribe to the show on all the platforms I'm on. And that goes a long way in helping fight against the algorithms that are suppressing shows and conversations like these. But if you are in a good financial situation and you do enjoy these podcasts, you enjoy the conversations and the guests I bring to you, please consider supporting the show. And there's plenty of ways of doing it. Of course, you can find all these ways in the show description or on my website, therippleeffectpodcast.com. You can donate monthly using Patreon, and you can donate as little as $1 a month. And if a small percentage of people who download and listen to the Ripple Effect Podcast donated as little as $1 a month, I could do this full time. So it shows that no donation is too little. And if you do support me on Patreon, you'll have access to our Patreon podcasts, which are podcasts I do with my Patreon supporters, and I release it as a Ripple Effect Podcast episode. So if you want to join us on the next Patreon podcast, donate as little as $1 a month. You can come on, talk about whatever you want to talk about, share whatever ideas you want to share, and you can also connect with myself and other listeners. If you want to do a one-time donation, we have a Venmo account, we have a PayPal account. We also have a crypto wallet if you want to send Ethereum or Bitcoin. You can also stream or listen to my music. Theory 6 is the artist, which is just myself. It's my solo project. And the song you hear in the intro is called The Ripple Effect. So find that EP anywhere you can get music, and that also can contribute to the Ripple Effect podcast. And a couple sponsors. The first one is Content Safe. Content Safe is how I get all my shows uploaded to all the video platforms I'm on. If you are a streamer, gamer, YouTuber, content creator of any sort, and you deal with videos, contact my dear friend Matt at Content Safe, and he'll hook you up if he knows you're a listener of the podcast, and he'll help you sync all your platforms together. So you only have to upload your thumbnails and description and videos to one platform, and then they'll magically appear on all the other platforms you're on. And I say magically because I don't know how he does it, but I know he does it, and he's been doing it for me for a while. And I couldn't possibly imagine how many hours of my life that he has saved me from spending just uploading video after video after video. So he saves me tons of time. He's a lifesaver. He's a time saver. And he also builds websites, which he built mine. And he does a bunch of stuff in regards to helping content creators. So if you're a content creator, check out contentsafe.co. Another sponsor is the University of Reason, created by my dear friend Richard Grove from the Tragedy and Hope website, and also the Grand Theft World podcast. If you're looking to learn some new skills or expand on some skills you already have, maybe connect with a community, maybe connect with like-minded people who can help you out and really help find your place and your niche in the world, please check out the University of Reason. You can help yourself and help the Ripple Effect podcast just by signing up and checking out their website. Last but not least, Element Electrolytes. It's an amazing product, founded and created by a OG in the keto, paleo, health, and nutrition community. His name is Rob Wolf. He's been a past guest on my show. He's also been on all the major shows that talk about health and nutrition. And he came up with this amazing product called Element Electrolytes. It's a powder you put in your water. It adds flavor, gives you the electrolytes you need to deal with the symptoms you might be dealing with that you might not even be aware is due to dehydration, like headaches, fatigue, muscle soreness. You can use the product while doing keto. You can use the product while fasting. It has no artificial anything. It's sweetened with stevia. It tastes amazing. If you're playing sports or you're doing something that's mentally fatiguing, Element Electrolytes can help. Obviously, most of the stuff you buy at a store or a gas station is full of artificial sweeteners and artificial flavors, which you won't find in Element Electrolytes. So Element gives you a safe and healthy and delicious way of adding flavor to your water or flavor to your coffee, which I have done with some of the new chocolate flavors. And if you use the link in the show description, you will help the Ripple Effect podcast, and you will get a free gift with every purchase. So please check out Element Electrolytes. You can stay hydrated and contribute to the Ripple Effect podcast. And of course, as always, don't forget to check out the merch store, which you can find on my website, or you can find in the show description, or you can go directly to the Ripple Effect podcast merch.com. You'll see all the stuff that I'm constantly wearing on the show, the t-shirts, the hoodies, the mugs, all that stuff, and much more is on the Ripple Effect podcast merch.com. Also, remember, we have a Telegram group chat if you want to connect with myself or other listeners. So go to the Ripple Effect podcast.com to find all these links and much, much more on my website. Thanks again, guys. Enjoy this amazing conversation, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Peace. A little bit about your background, like I said, where you're from, what inspired you, books, people, whatever helped mold who Matt is and how he thinks, and anything else that you think might be interesting to share.
Yeah, okay, I'll do my best. Well, again, pleasure to join you today, Ricky. And yeah, I'm assuming that most people listening might have read a thing or two that I've maybe written or maybe heard me before and might want to know a little bit more, like you said. So this is good. It's a good starting point. From my personal story, as you called it, the origin story. It's not really much of an origin story. I was just sort of I would categorize myself for most of my life as having wasted a lot of time. I guess normie might be the word or label you would put on the persona. I didn't really have too much of an intellectual identity. I'm based in Canada. I'm Canadian. I'm a senior fellow of the American University in Moscow right now, and co-founder and director of the Rising Tide Foundation. And I've been editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review for about a decade. I began that platform in the summer of 2012. Going back, I mean, before the age of 20, nothing that I could think of would really explain why I did these things or made these choices for the next 20 years of my life. I'm about 40 now. So I guess, yeah, from that standpoint, I was an artist. My mind was focused more on trying to think about how I could possibly make a living with art. And, I studied illustration and design in university, followed up by a couple of years doing fine arts and film animation at Concordia. It's a university in Montreal. And in the course of that process, at a certain point, I found myself on a little team doing a little mini documentary for a school assignment. And part of it just involved me looking a little bit more into 9/11. And it's hard to explain, but you're downloading some bit torrents, some little videos. For those who are maybe too young, they don't know this, but there used to be a thing called bit torrents that was really big back in like 2003, 2004. And you just download off the beaten path articles, videos. And so I found myself listening to a few lectures from people who were pretty good researchers. And I was just lucky to have downloaded the right couple of lectures and a couple of documentaries that at least was the first time I had a shock to my system. before that, I just sort of had a very bland, vague idea that corporations manipulate the world and do bad things. But it's like it was a very underdefined, homogenous, blah idea that I think most people tend to have a sense of it in some level, but it didn't have much shape. So the first time I had a real jolt where I was like, okay, there's an intelligibility behind not only why we're living under these big false narratives, but you can actually the mind can be brought through rational steps with evidence and coherent reasoning to discover what actually did happen regarding that controlled demolition, which also then awakens a whole bunch of other questions like, well, what else is controlled? Certainly it can't be everything else is fine and it's just that. And it can't be that just happened overnight. There must be a process in history that it resulted in something taking control of the functions of what I thought were legitimate governments that I live in, such that it could kill thousands of its own people for political motives that would involve international repercussions, sending whole civilizations in the Middle East back to the Stone Age, expanding a police state, both, at home where I live. So that sort of put me on my path. And I think for anybody who goes on this path, everybody is unique. We all have our own psycho, spiritual, personal experiences and how we process things, but there's certain common themes that I think this involves. One of the big ones, the 9/11 wake up thing, quickly leads you into matters of international finance. What's really the banking complex above nation states? What is the structure of what you could call maybe shadow government today? People call it deep state, but whatever. There's many names, same thing. So, but you have to sort of start with the understanding or the discovery that most everything you're being told to take for granted is a lie. And as soon as you have that, you're good. Like you generally can, your flame can go and light its path. But if you don't have that and you still treat the shadows that were being given and told are reality by CNN or whatever, if you treat that like real, you're not going to get anywhere. You're always going to just be like the Plato allegory of the cave that I alluded to, that the people chained to the cave wall looking at the shadows and hearing the sounds from the puppet masters behind them. You won't really get very far if you're adapting to that, which is unfortunately what most people have been duped into doing. So that was my pathway out of it. And just to accelerate this, because it could be a long story. So I guess I found myself just trying to figure out, well, how do you live with that knowledge? And I had a choice, and a lot of people tend to sort of relegate it to the side. And for a little while I did. Like, I can't cope with this knowledge, like it's too, I'm too disempowered to do anything about it. So I might as well just try to live my life as if it wasn't true. But that doesn't work that long, right? That's limited. So at a certain point, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to focus on the truth. And it became, I went through a bit of depression and you fight it out. And I found myself at a certain point just really hungry for what solutions might be available, because the crisis is then, well, if intergenerational conspiracies have been pushing us towards predetermined goals that are terrible. And these are ideas I was coming to back in, I think it was 2005 was sort of my big jolty wake up period, 2004, 2005. But, okay, if these international conspiracies by an oligarchical class has been moving us to a very dismal fate for a very long time, is there any reason to have hope? Like, are they maybe just so powerful that there's nothing we could do? And maybe even people who I thought might have tried to do good were actually just controlled opposition. You start getting into these like scary mental places where it's like, very nihilistic. So I really wanted to try to, I made myself somewhat obsessed about trying to figure out, do they really have secret knowledge? First of all, do they have like real secret power that is above the 99.9% of the people that they can use to their advantage to control us? And has it really always been controlled? And has there never been any point of resistance that has created a crisis for the oligarchy? And thus, could I, if such resistance exists, could that give me insights into what solutions would be available today? So I found over the course, after about a 2-year process of, I was writing a lot, I was doing little videos and things to try to express and organize my own mind and what I was researching, which helped a lot. Writing helps. Um, at that point, or having a podcast, a lot of people are having podcasts, but it makes it a more active process where you're both a learner and a teacher at the same time. And that just makes the whole integration of new thoughts and the recognition of false thoughts that you thought were true, but actually don't measure up to new discovered realities. It makes it a more organic process of refinement of knowledge towards the pursuit of wisdom. And if it's done too voyeuristically or too just consumer based, it doesn't really seep in very well. It doesn't have that qualitative value. So I was doing that, and then I stumbled on during a smoke break in 2006, while I was at work, a political stand with it was basically a Canadian branch and a small outlet of maybe 8 or 9 people representing the LaRouche organization, which is you heard about Lyndon LaRouche?
Yeah, I feel like I've had somebody on the show or maybe I've met somebody. I don't know. I've had some connection to them. I don't know if I've met somebody at maybe some event somewhere, or I feel like I might have had somebody on the show representative. But yeah, so I'm somewhat familiar with them. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm not involved with them anymore, but that was a big part of my what I have to attribute to being some of the more useful discoveries that I had made in terms of thinking about history, strategy, and most importantly, method of thinking. Like, what would be a more fruitful method, a way of thinking about thinking that I've been able to put to use in a way that I value, that bears good results, was through my discovery of that organization and my volunteering with them for about a decade until 2017. And essentially, what caught my eye was in the signage. It was a political table in Montreal, and there was some literature they were giving away. Maybe 3 or 4 people were at the table, and I remember having a conversation because one of the signs alluded to the depopulation agenda, which was something I had recently come to terms with, but I couldn't quite make sense of why was it wrong. Like, I had discovered on my own terms that, okay, there does seem to be beyond the pursuit of money by the oligarchy, it does seem to be that money is just a tool or a means towards an ends, but the ends seem to have much more to do with reducing the world population, and that's why they want to get rid of nation states. So I came to these ideas, but I was like, I was really pissed off with myself because I couldn't think about or prove why that was such a bad thing. Because I had my typical images of, like, overpopulated Calcutta and dirty industries paving over nature. And so I still had a lot of that stuff in my soul holding me down, thinking, well, maybe we just are overpopulated. Maybe the oligarchy actually is making the tough decisions that we're not capable of democratically doing ourselves. I was still in that place. And so what was a very beneficial thing was that in the course of reading the writings of Lyndon LaRouche and a lot of the associated researchers affiliated with that organization who had done a lot of work for decades, they'd been around since the late 60s. It helped me resolve that problem. And I finally was able to understand more deeply why overpopulation is not only a fake issue, but it's actually a very natural and good thing to have 8 billion, 9 billion, 12 billion people. It's actually a beautiful thing that human beings can do that and other animals don't do that, because the fact that we can do that means that we have within us a power that allows us to always overcome limits to growth. Like, every species, including us, always has limits to our growth potential, always pressing on us. We can't have, back in, let's say it was 1902, we couldn't have 10 billion people if we wanted to. We couldn't have more than, a certain life expectancy of maybe, I think in Montreal, it was 43 years of age average. We couldn't have more than maybe 50 years if we were doing everything right, because we were also ignorant of we hadn't made certain discoveries yet. So, the human being, if it's given its proper capacities, creative access to its creative energy and inspiration, and you're given all of those proper educational, cultural experiences that is our right to have, to discover who we actually are, then we are the resource that makes resources. We're always making discoveries. We're the problem solving species. We're always, other species kind of are the adaptive species. They are genetically wired to try to make the best of their situation based on their environmental and genetic characteristics, but they more or less can only adapt. But an animal's not going to use fire. Animals will all run away from fire. Human beings are the only species that will overcome the fear of fire and learn how to harness it and then use it better and better to make life better for ourselves. So that has measurable impacts. That's the first approximation of the mind matter paradox. Like that process is invisible. It's sort of immaterial, because like an idea is not material. A discovery is an idea and it's not material, or neither is an intention. It's not material, but it's existent. But it has measurable material effects. We can have more people, higher quality of life. And so LaRouche worked this stuff out over decades. And I was shocked that I hadn't heard of the name. I felt I was a pretty educated person by this point. I was into conspiracy theories. I'd read a lot, watched a lot of things, and I had never heard of LaRouche, who'd been around since the late 60s, running for the presidency like 8 times. He's dead today. But he'd been around a lot, became the advisor to several major international governments at different points of crisis, like really. And I was like, how do I not know about this? And I realized at that point what an effective job the oligarchy had done to try to pretend or either slander him out of existence. So anytime I would bring up his name to other informed people I respected, I would get emotional responses that would just almost break down and just dismiss him as a cult freak, anti-Semite or whatever. And I was like, wait a minute, but I've read him and you haven't read him. Why are you reacting so emotionally? And I realized that it was the effect of a lot of programming. There's been a lot of sort of hypnotic techniques used to sort of get everybody's minds to turn off based on the name and not actually look at what he did, or just ignore him completely and pretend he doesn't exist. So that was a big thing for me.
I was just going to say, and isn't that the similar reaction we get in regards to a lot of the topics that we've researched much more than others, and yet you get that same reaction if it's 9/11, if it's vaccines, if it's whatever it may be. You get this emotional reaction, and like you said, it's like they're programmed to react this way, even if the information that's coming out of your mouth is better research, even if what you're saying makes sense. It doesn't matter what comes out of your mouth. It's like those topics come with an emotional reaction that's like uncontrollable, and I guess it is, thinking is unnecessary. It's like I've already been programmed to react this way to these topics, so I don't have to have a discussion about it. I've already, my perspective on these topics have already been made for me, and that's kind of one of the dilemmas that we have when you go down these rabbit holes, is that you spend so much time thinking about these things and uncovering these things, and in a way it's almost enjoyable because you feel like a detective, like you connect the dots and you find, I always say, like when I was really kind of I'm always in the process of kind of discovering myself in the world around me, but when I really started the process, I almost found it fun to be like, oh, I found this puzzle piece. I don't know what it means or how it fits or where it fits, but I feel like this is something important. I'm going to hold on to this. And then as you gather more puzzle pieces, they start connecting and you're like, oh God, this is all making sense now, and it really, there's so much of life is like that, where it's just like you're gathering these puzzle pieces, hoping by the end of your journey, you can kind of get enough of them where, the world makes sense to you, or your perspective on the world makes sense. And but so many of the things you talked about is so true. We all go through these bumps in the road where you're like, dude, I'm going into some dark places and I'm spending so much time thinking about these things. Maybe ignorance is bliss. Maybe not, understanding these things, maybe ignoring them and just moving on my life because I have zero control over these outcomes. Maybe that's a better way of living. And it's funny because another Canadian who was just on my show, James Corbett, who's a friend of mine, who's one of the first guests on my show back in the day, 2013, and a great guy, and I'm sure probably one of the 9/11 researchers you were referring to, that I'm sure you ran into some of his work. And but we've talked about this before, about how like neither of our wives could care less about what we do. Like they could care less. Like they have no interest. It doesn't matter who you interview. It doesn't matter how important your work seems. Like they could, and we talk about how like sometimes that's like it's frustrating and it can be at some point you're like, I just want you to acknowledge like this is somewhat important or interesting, and then but in another way it's kind of beneficial because you can detach from it a little bit. I'm like, if I was with a spouse that was equally down these rabbit holes, as far down these rabbit holes as I am, and all we're talking about this, I'm like, it could be probably depressing, and you'd probably feel like I need to detach from it, which is why I think, if you're an artist, like you were saying, writing music was my passion growing up. I used to love writing. I felt like writing was therapy, and it just putting it down on paper for some reason, emotionally and mentally felt like I was doing something, like I was some way removing it from inside me and putting it outside me, so it wasn't affecting me anymore. And it's funny because I've heard people talk about writing nasty emails or text messages, like if you just write it out but you don't send it, like instead of deciding like, should I send this or should I write this or not write this, how about just write it but don't send it, and that will help kind of get it off your chest. And I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense, because if you're a writer, you do that all the time. You're constantly kind of writing stuff to get it off your chest, and it also forces you to kind of reflect on things too. It forces you to kind of analyze and reflect on like, how do I really feel on these things? Because one of the big problems, and I promise I'll let you talk, sorry I go on these long rants, one of the things that I find really interesting is like, and I've talked to Dr. Jessica Rose a lot about this, who during the COVID lockdowns and stuff like that, where we were talking a lot, and about how like our worldviews, right, like somebody before us build a foundation, and they're like, your worldview can only be built on this foundation, so you can expand from this foundation, but you're restricted to this foundation. And I've heard, I forget what interview I heard you talk about UFOs and some of that stuff, and we've the topics become kind of, I don't know, just more popular of late because of all the sightings and people, credible people talking about it. And it makes you kind of rethink reality, makes you rethink like all these theories that we've accepted as truths. And I'm always one of those people that I'm super skeptical of everything. I don't believe, and like you said, like once you start uncovering some things, I'm like, what else are they lying to me about? That's why even like the flat earth thing, I'm like, that's not too crazy to believe. I'm like, why wouldn't? I'm like, maybe there is some agenda. Why wouldn't they lie to you about that? I'm not saying they're right or wrong, but I'm just saying like, I don't dismiss anything. I'm just like, there is no thing that would be too crazy to believe from my perspective, because once you get to all these conclusions that like, okay, this was a lie, that was a lie, this was a lie, you're like, okay, well, why would it stop there? Why not lie about this or that, or the nature of the universe? Who knows? And you want to expand on any of that? Sorry, I gave you way too much.
No, there's a lot of good content you just floated there. I still take and run with an element and see where it goes, and we'll just throw it back and forth. I think for me, the one of the I'm grateful that I don't know why, it's not like I ever had anybody who told me to do this, but it was a good habit I picked up early on. And maybe it was because I was a bit of a blank slate. Like, not like I mentioned, I didn't have a sense of like patriotism for Canada, or what it means to be Canadian, or what it means to be even a human being, or what it means to be political. Like, none of these things were there. I was kind of just going at it straight from like 0 to 1,000. Like, okay, from nothing to like, okay, oligarchical forces have been manipulating our society for a long time. What does that imply? Okay, like so that was a very, very traumatic and bumpy learning curve. Mistakes, mishypotheses are made along the way. But one thing that I did pick up was that whenever I would find somebody delivering a lecture or an interview or whatever, who seems to exhibit wisdom, because I would resonate very much to those people who could teach I could see that they could try to replicate or make transparent what their own minds were doing, going from ignorance to knowledge of something, how they came to a discovery. And they were trying to not really just persuade me or use embellishment in their language or something. Like they weren't using techniques of just rhetoric for rhetoric's sake to persuade, but they were really trying to make their lines of thought reasonable and accessible to my mind so I could replicate that. And I could see that they're both in the past when I read writers who really generated ideas and put into motion their thoughts that had real high quality value. They do that, and I found people like Mike Rupert, other investigative reporters who would do that. I would take note of things that either they had written or books that they referred to as having an important influence on their pursuit towards the answer to whatever questions that they were pursuing. And I would try my best to go in the library and where I would buy or whatever, and I would hunt down the articles or the books, and I would try to read them. And I was doing that with the journaling process. So I was writing a lot, and I was writing in the form of questions. And I forget who told me, but I heard somebody give that advice, and I started using it. And I was like, that works so much better than me just trying to like take a bunch of notes down and like stuff data in my head, which I know a lot of people were doing, but it was heavy and it wasn't working very well because it's just trivia at a certain point, right? It's facts, it's things. Like knowledge becomes reduced to just things you hold, and you can only hold so much, right? You're not a computer. We're not computers. So when I started writing in a more question orientation, like I would process, material, but I would whenever a paradox, something didn't make sense, I would write it down. And that became my focus, was the paradox, the question. If this, why is this? If we're just monkeys, but how are there 8 billion of us? If monkeys can't have more than maybe a few million of their species, why are there 8 billion? How is that possible? What must be there that allows this paradox to not be a paradox, right? So anyway, I was trying to do things like that. And I think when you start moving in a fruitful place, which is not approved of by oligarchical systems ever, like oligarchical systems 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, never approve of the minds of their victim, their target population, thinking in terms of building, because we're all mapping, right? We're modeling and mapping in this reciprocal dance of subjective and objective, right? When from baby to death, we're like we're shaping, we're in constant state of flux. We're like, trying to make sense of how does this machine work? A baby gets a certain realization that I'm like controlling this thing. Like, it's not me, right? I'm not this hand, but I'm doing this. My will is making this happen, right? And it's kind of like we take it for granted as adults, but it's like, that's a big thing for a little weak kid, to start doing that. And you're always modeling, what adults are sounding like. You're learning speech, you're learning to walk, you're learning attributes. And at a certain point, unfortunately, if your society is suffering under mediocrity and a slave culture, those adults the adults that you're being inspired to model yourself can only take you so far, because at a certain point you start realizing, okay, well, those adults are actually themselves infantile in so many of the adults are victims of an infantilism that has not permitted them to access identities aligned with mature wisdom, which is what a healthy human being would normally, you'd think, move into a place where we start as a mature species loving wisdom as the highest of pleasures. But we don't access that. Again, shitty culture, shitty education system, all very much influenced by oligarchs that want to try to keep us in the cave. But so you start realizing, okay, what is this way of thinking that's not approved of? Well, it's like you don't believe, or you don't allow your convictions to be given to anything you haven't proven to yourself. You don't just believe anything blindly, right? That formula you're taught to memorize and repeat in school. You don't believe the formula because you got a good grade for it, or because you memorized it and it seems to work in this X, Y, and Z situation. It's because you proved what was something that was true. You proved what was the geometrical construct underlying, let's say, the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Well, that's just symbols. That's not just knowing that or memorizing it is not knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem. To think like Pythagoras means to look at an actual triangle, a right angle triangle, and figure out, well, why is it that this space of area over the longest length, the hypotenuse, is equivalent to the two smaller sides of the triangle when you add them together? And how can you prove that that's the case geometrically in all infinite possible circumstances? And you can do it. A child can do that. 7, 8 years old, a kid can actually do that. If they're given good questions, they can figure it out on their own. But if you get too much into the habit of just memorizing what experts tell you and believing things, or like, the earth is round. I personally, just so you know, I believe the earth is round. But the reason why I believe the earth is round, I don't think one should ever dismiss somebody who says, well, isn't it flat? Like, how do you know it's not flat? I don't think that should ever be dismissed. But I think the question would be, well, have you proven that it's round? I mean, we could be shown a picture, but a picture could be manipulated. So how do you know, right? And I was fortunate, and this is one of the fun things when I was within the first years of the LaRouche organization. There was an educational process that was really built up around replicating scientific discoveries that were big. Like, so look to the actual writings of people who made discoveries and see if they would tell you how they made the discoveries, and they do almost all the time. So there are key people we just focused on a lot of Plato, Platonic dialogues, a lot of Apollonian solids constructions, a lot of Kepler, a lot of Leibniz. Like, just figure out, how did the calculus get discovered? And one of the over one weekend, a few of us had we basically did something where we wanted to prove why the Earth was round. And basically, we had some friends. We looked at the meridians of the Earth, and we just knew that there was a place in Vermont, south of Montreal, not that far distant. We basically had we had cell phones, so we had a couple of friends at a certain time of day when the sun was at a certain place we all agreed upon. We all had our little sticks, and we all had we had an agreed upon piece of paper, and we just noticed, just like people could see my pencil cast a little shadow at a certain moment. We just called and we said, okay, now measure the length of the shadow. Okay, so we just measured the length of the shadow in Vermont, a few hundred kilometers south in Montreal, and we got the differential. It wasn't the same length of the shadow at the same time of day. And you could then just simply take the differential of the two little, the distance, which you can measure the distance between Montreal and I forget which city in Vermont, and then take the differential, take the distance, take the difference of the two shadows, and I'll let people try to think about how they would then figure out, extrapolate that to see, well, is there a contour based on the difference of the sizes? And sure enough, the contour will give you the size that was discovered by Eratosthenes, a student of the Platonic Academy 2,000 years ago, who had done something very similar in Egypt when he first discovered or calculated the circumference of the Earth with no satellites or anything like that. So you can do things like that, but our school system is so crappy that it just tells us to memorize things, that are commonly held accepted beliefs that experts agree upon, which doesn't result in knowledge, very, very bad foundations. And so people can easily either have a right opinion, but then as soon as they're given an argument can be framed. Like, you can make an argument today if you wanted to, based on all of the observational data that we can be given of all the planets and the stars, that the moon is in the center of the solar system and the moon is not moving, and we're moving around the moon, and the sun is moving around the moon, and all the planets are moving around the moon. You can do that. You could build a model, and I've seen it done. A friend of mine did it. And it accounts for nearly all the observational data. So you could use pure logic, with a couple of core assumptions, you could build a whole a matrix that will account for anything. Logic and math themselves are just useful tools, but if you start thinking that that's where reality is, you will believe in anything, that there's like 7 dimensions or 13 dimensions for this string theory model, or 80,000 dimensions or 80,000 genders or whatever. Like, everything could be equally justified by some elegant mathematical model, because that's not reality. And that's how we're sort of kept malleable and moving in a certain direction according to what experts tell us about pandemics or climate change, or what the markets are telling us the future of the economy is going to be, and why it's fine to bail out zombie bankrupt speculators, and why that's somehow not a bad idea, or shutting down energy to replace hydrocarbons with windmills, and that's not going to kill people. Like, people have been really smart, people who have PhDs have been led to think that those types of activities are fine. It's yeah.
But isn't that that kind of hits on what you were saying. And I remember like years ago I had Daniele Bignelli on. He's this Italian philosopher and author, and he was on Rogan's podcast back in the day a bunch of times, and has a podcast called History on Fire. And I remember like his dad is this famous Italian philosopher, and I was like super self-conscious about like being able to hold a conversation with him. And you go through that like imposter syndrome, like who the hell am I to talk to these people who are PhDs? I'm like, I barely graduated high school. But it was I remember him telling me, he's like, listen, he's like, memorizing information for information's sake is completely pointless. It's meaningless. It's like, how does it help understand, or how does it help you understand yourself or the world around you? And it really put things in perspective, because a lot of times you hear somebody just regurgitate information and it sounds impressive to some extent. And then you start listening and you're like, okay, he's not really putting like anything into practice. He's not explaining to me why these things are important. He's just regurgitating stuff. And and that was always my issue with school, was that like it was just, I was being asked to regurgitate information. Nobody was explaining to me why it was important. Sometimes I use the example like, okay, if I give a bunch of random words and I say memorize this, it's much harder than if I give you a bunch of words in a sentence that means something, right? You'll memorize that much easier because it means something. And so a lot of times I look back at growing up and going to school, and I was born in Portugal. I was always a little bit behind, because when I came to America, Portuguese is my first language, and I'm kind of always playing catch up. And then eventually I'm just like, I guess I'm just an idiot according to the school system. I'm special ed immigrant kid who's never going to catch up. And then I realized like I just wasn't turned on by any of this. None of it was thought provoking. None of it was interesting. And then once I started going down these rabbit holes by myself and be like really uncovering the interesting things about history, the interesting things about philosophy, I'm like, wow, I actually like these subjects. I just didn't like the delivery in which they were trying to, give me this information. And so yeah, it's and I think artistically, like it's beneficial, like being I think if you're an artistic person, you typically are trying to uncover something or seek something. I remember I was always like really fascinated with psychology growing up, and then I met somebody, a psychologist, who told me to like, the majority of psychologists need a psychiatrist. It's like, most of them are trying, they get into the field for the wrong reason, not because they're trying to help other people, because they're actually trying to solve their own problems. And it's funny because growing up, I've always thought about that, because when I meet somebody who's in that field, that line of work, and I'm like, oh yeah, they're one of those people. They're one of the ones who actually they have a lot of their own issues that they're trying to solve. And you're trying to, you got intrigued with this because you're trying to solve your own problems. But art, but it's weird because like, so you're an artist. Growing up, I used to love drawing. I love music. I love poetry. I love anything that sparked imagination. And I had this, I assumed, okay, and maybe it's because I was young and I don't know, but I assumed, I'm like, anybody who's artistic must be into conspiracies, because I'm like, it's it is the essence of uncovering something or discovering something, or the fringe. There's something sexy about the fringe, going against the grain. I loved music that was, I think we're similar in age. I'm a 85 baby. And like I grew up with industrial music and deathcore and new metal and all this. I loved anything that went against the grain. And I'm just like, this is like this type of thinking that, or this interest in whatever is fringe, maybe is why I'm into uncovering lies about our history, or uncovering lies about the way we look at the world. But then I find all these musicians and artists that are completely opposite.
They're just creatures of the system completely.
Yeah, like Rage Against the Machine. I mean, I know I'm not the only one who talks about them, because it's. I mean, I grew up thinking like, oh my God, Rage Against the Machine, like they're anti-establishment, and then now I look at them and I'm just like, this is the saddest,
Pathetic.
yeah, pathetic band. And it's funny because there's this band from Ireland I always described them as the Irish Rage Against the Machine. They were kind of big around the same time, but and they're called 1 Minute Silence. And I had the singer on my show, amazing, just thought provoking guy. He, I mean, you just listen to him, and I didn't even I didn't know until I think right before the interview, his manager told me that he has Asperger's, and I'm just like, oh, that's why his thinking is like so just was so intriguing to me. It's almost like he had this different way of looking at things. And but I'm like, I wonder if I reconnect with him. I'm like, if because I'm like, okay, I always relate them to like Rage Against the Machine because they're kind of similar style, and they were very good at like uh good music, but they also found ways of introducing people to like some of the Irish history that you might not be familiar with, in their music. So I would learn about like, some of the civil battles and why Northern Ireland and why is there a Northern Ireland, and so it's like all these, which I found fascinating, but I'm like, I wonder if they fell for it, because I had Jesse Ventura on years ago, and when he was drinking the COVID Kool-Aid, I'm like, how? I'm like, you were like the face of conspiracy theories. I'm like, you didn't believe anything and you fell for it. And it's like, it was like, I didn't get it. And I remember talking to Sean Stone a while ago, and I think it was on I host another show called The Union of the Unwanted with Sam Tripoli and Charlie Robinson and Mike Midnight Mike from the OBDM show. And I remember like we were talking about this on one of those episodes, and I'm like, Sean, can you explain to me how did Jesse fall for it? I'm like, Jesse much better than I do. I'm like, you're friends with his son. You did shows together, and I just, what's in your opinion? Like, what do you think helped you see things the way you see things, and then the difference between somebody like yourself or myself who is truly skeptical, and then somebody who might think they're skeptical but really have been, in some way, I guess, brainwashed or social engineered into kind of believing the mainstream narrative on things.
First question, do you remember what Sean's response was? Like, what did he think caused Jesse to like misstep on this?
It's funny. I kind of felt I don't remember specifically what his response was. I'll have to go back. I think it was the last time he was on the Union of Unwanted. I remember telling him like, "Hey, Sean, I was gonna ask you this off air, but you know what? I'll put you on the spot. I'm like, I'll ask you." And because I was just so disappointed. I remember during COVID, people sending me the clip of one of the episodes of the Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, where there was, I forget which doctor it was, where she was saying how like they were talking about the eugenics agenda, and then how they're going to use vaccines. And I'm like, people would send me this clip during the COVID lockdown in 2020. I'm like, oh my God, like this is I'm like, I hope people are seeing this and this video circulates, because this isn't a new theory or a new thing. And yet he's the same guy who kind of fell for it. I personally think, and I can't remember, I think Sean Stone politely kind of didn't directly answer it. I don't think he wanted to offend anybody, or maybe he didn't,
Yeah. He had a classy response of just, he's probably on his own path.
I think what happened to Jesse Ventura was something that happened to a lot of people who, like, I think the divide and conquer tactic is used over and over again, as you know, and I think it works so well that people's hatred towards Trump completely blinded them of any evidence. And it's like so many things that wasn't a pro or anti-Trump thing became a pro or anti-Trump thing. Like everything became political, where, wearing, I think it was Rogan who said, wearing a mask was the left's version of a MAGA hat. Like, it's just like, everything became political. It wasn't about like, do masks work or not? It's all like, if you don't wear a mask, you're a Trump supporter. If you do wear a mask, you're not a Trump supporter. It's like everything became. So I wonder if that was what happened. I also had Dennis McKenna on a few times back in the day when I had him on. We talked a lot about plant medicine and all that stuff, and I'm a fan of his work. I'm a fan of a lot of his documentaries and his books and stuff. And obviously, there's a lot of conspiracies and surrounding his brother and some of that whole LSD movement. But I remember last time I had him on, like 2 seconds in a conversation, and we agree on just about everything in regards to big pharma and plant medicines and finding natural alternatives to dealing with disease and sicknesses. He went on this anti-Trump rant, and I'm just like, this was like right before
This
the
is a
election.
lot of place. Yeah, go on.
The crazy thing is, it made me think about how Rogan would constantly say on his show, he's like, if we just give everybody psychedelics, everybody would just be in love and they would see through the bullshit. And I'm like, I know a guy who did tons of psychedelics. I mean, he's friends with Timothy Leary, and he still fell for it. You know what I mean? Like, so to me, it's like,
Well, yeah, like there's a reason why people like Lawrence Rockefeller poured countless countless millions into the psychedelic research movement and Esalen Institute and Tavistock and the Human Potential Movement. And in fact, Terence McKenna, one of his primary bankrollers for a very long time was Lawrence Rockefeller. And I'm sorry, like what Lawrence Rockefeller represents and what he is a part of in a self-aware way, along with his brothers, like they're born into a family mercenary dynasty, but it's not like they, on the one hand, they're working or they're working to condition and enslave the world under a political dystopia of a supranational oligarchy above nation states. And then on the other hand, they really just like want to free your mind and love and really care about truth and opening up your horizons and perspectives to exploring new realities with psychedelics. And it's no. That's not it. They're two sides of the same thing. I'm sorry. And I'm not saying that there isn't potentially some viability for a healthy approach to some of these drugs, perhaps. I mean, there might be therapeutic components and other things but we are so far removed from any type of organization of society that would possibly look in those directions in an honest way. I would just say at this point, it's a rigged, that's a whole rigged discussion. And another thing that, Lawrence Rockefeller was also known for is the big funder of, and I mean, if you saw my previous discussions on this as well, or my writings on this, it's going to be a big part of my upcoming book. Was on UFOs. He was the primary funder of something called the Disclosure Project back in the early 90s. And he was the one who had met with Bill Clinton, Hillary, John Podesta, recruited them to his disclosure, cause as part of, uniting all of the different UFO groups around one, more controlled system. Not that a lot of them weren't already controlled, but when you look at like that is not disassociated from his work on psychedelics or his political work with Nelson and David and his other brother, whose name I forget, Stephen, I think, on the, who crafted the Earth Charter with Maurice Strong. It's like they're all different parts of trying to synthesize or create a new type of society and a new type of sets of narratives and cultural norms that would be more conducive to a global slave class, that would be much more malleable, and that would be also able to be reset, because I mean, these guys think of human beings like they're automatons, like they're computers, that you could just like reset the computer, wipe the hard drive, create a new blank slate, and then reconstruct people's personalities according to your programmers' whimsies. Now that's not how human beings actually are. We are not computers. It's not actually that easy to just erase an individual's persona and reconstruct them as MK Ultra tried to do. Which, by the way, if you look at a lot of the UFO flying saucer working groups from Britain, or that were done in the United States under Project Blue Book, or in Britain earlier under the first flying saucer working party under Sir Henry Tizard, who ran British radar systems throughout World War II. These are all the same people who created MK Ultra as well. So Henry Tizard was part of the original MK Ultra study groups that were set up in Montreal at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel with Oman Salant and various leading CIA officials who were then meeting in the United States, putting this stuff online to figure out how do you do this? And the idea was always, how do you reconstruct humanity? That's always been the objective, using individual case studies and then group case studies, and then figuring out how you do this for whole nations to do shock therapy break them down, and then reconstruct them, whether it was in Chile under Pinochet or whether it was in Russia in the 90s or whatever, what they want to do, what the Great Reset today, which involves a lot of shock trauma through economic manipulation and other things to create scarcity. Then they could reconstruct an abused people the way, people suffering shell shock in World War I, they were able to discover, oh yeah, these people who've been through like crazy trauma are inclined to disassociate themselves from who they thought they were before the war, or to compartmentalize hyper-traumatic memories that they can't access, that somebody who's able to wield certain neuro-linguistic programming techniques or other things could maybe feasibly trigger certain latent memories that then become active at will, forms of just hypnotic techniques that are then used on the broader zeitgeist, as we've seen under especially COVID. So again, you have this very interesting enmeshment between the psychedelic movement, the green movement as well, like this whole idea of protecting nature from human beings, which really emerged over the dead bodies of people like John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and all of these, actual legit statesmen who gave their lives fighting against this Malthusian agenda that was coming online. De Gaulle, Enrico Mattei. I mean, there's a big list of people who were killed in the 60s who were resisting this new ideology. But so the green movement, the psychedelic movement, the UFO movement, unfortunately, yeah, I mean, this might freak a lot of people out or might piss them off that I'm saying this, but I'm pretty sure I can prove it. Are all geopolitical operations designed to create a new type of cultural matrix that would, again, be more malleable. The last thing I'll say to this on the question of like what you brought up regarding why I think art might be useful in getting at conspiracies in a way that maybe a logician who's like too logic heavy might miss, is like I'm more the visual arts. I was never good at music. I see you're a musician, and your mind is tuned to a musical mode. But from the standpoint of like the arts, thumbnail sketches are key. And I think you have to sort of like, when you're coming up with a new concept, a piece of concept art or whatever, you're always like trying to get the thought as quickly as you can onto paper, right? And sketch it out. And you're trying to get the whole. And you worry about the details, you go through drafts and drafts till you get the right composition, the right feeling that you want, but you're refining it. When you got a sort of style, a system you want, you can then start working out the details. You start adding the shade, you start adding the line work, a little bit more detail. Then you can maybe get a little bit into the coloring, into the rendering. And there's like a process. You can't skip steps. If you do, it creates really stiff or bad art, But if you do it in a sort of, I guess, just natural way, and I really like comic book arts, you're telling a story, you're trying to like convey, or storyboarding was my thing. But you're still trying to convey a story, you're trying to do it well, you're trying to engage. And so when I was thinking about like, well, what is my mind doing when I'm trying to come to a discovery of politics or history, or trying to piece together a puzzle, I couldn't get far if I didn't have a general thumbnail sketch of a whole process. I try to have it, a few thousand years as a thumbnail sketch in my mind that I can use as context to set the context of what is the particular thing I'm going to look at the moment. But I have to situate it within a whole, and the whole is getting more refined. It's changing a little bit according to new discoveries. It's being, it's being, but as you refine your understanding of the parts that now fit into a whole, you now have real knowledge that you can build on. You're not just building on an assumption and an assumption and an assumption. You're building on that. That's just sand, right? The castle will fall if it's built on those sorts of things. But if you have it, okay, this is a discovery I've made. I'm now going to see what new questions emerge from this little set of discoveries that flow from that. And it might not be directly, literally connected to it, but it will not be disassociated from it either. And so there's this dance, right, between like the data and the thing we're holding in our imagination as a whole, because the thumbnail sketch is still a function of the imagination. We're never going to see the whole. We're never going to see all of humanity, but we have an idea of humanity. I'm going to see you as an individual human. I could see a group of humans, but I can't see humanity. that's a concept that's a little bit more abstract, but real, and it's being refined as I'm looking at the details and jumping back and forth. And I think, yeah, people who are either too art heavy or too logic heavy, if you're too imbalanced in either domain, you won't get very far. And the people who just like think with their feelings, as like we probably encountered a lot of very like lazy minded artist types who they don't have the intellectual self-discipline or rigor to see even their own idiotic self-contradictions, like the Rage Against the Machine fools or so many other types who can't see their own contradictions, and they can't think rigorously about anything beyond their personal sensual creative experience, which there's no rigor, there's no scaffolding, right? Whereas the overly math heavy logic types, they don't have the flexibility to break from their formulas or break from their models, and they can't dance with their information. It gets really rigid and kind of anal, and that doesn't. You got to find a way to sort of try to ever make both worlds work together, and the aesthetic. Because I mean, what's a lie, right? Last thing but if you don't have a sense of ugliness, it's difficult to see a lie. Like a lie is not something. It might sound even pretty. Listen to Barack Obama speak. It sounds pretty. Who would think that there's like this insidious intentions and agendas that are ugly as sin behind the surface nice words? Or a truth might sometimes sound rough and jagged and maybe not nice to the ear. You might not like hearing some truths. That's why some people get kind of like crazed and enraged when you just tell them the truth about whatever pandemic being a fraud or, whatever, 9/11, global warming, whatever, pick a thing, right? But it's true. There's a quality of beauty and ugliness associated with a lie or a truth, because those are the effects of intentions. The intention is either a beautiful intention or an ugly intention. Oligarchs always operate in a cult of ugliness, and they have to destroy our ability to differentiate between ugly and beauty. Without that aesthetic quality within, we're incapable of finding, everything is equally homogeneously like, I guess there's no truth. Every opinion must be created equal. You get this like just blah liberalism that makes you all mushy. Maybe there's infinite genders after all.
Did you grow up watching the X-Men? I know you said you were in comic books. You grow up watching the X-Men on Fox?
I had a huge X-Men comic collection, Uncanny and the Jim Lee series, and I mean, I was more comic books, but I watched Saturday morning cartoons and stuff. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I was a Marvel guy. I wasn't. I remember when they came out with the first X-Men movie. I'm like, oh my God, this is so awesome. They're bringing all these cartoons and comic book characters that I grew up loving. I used to collect the cards also, and I'm like, to bring them to life. And now they have raped my excitement out of me, because I'm like, now every time there's a new Marvel movie, I could care less. And I'm like, I never thought this day would come where I wouldn't be excited about a Marvel movie. And it's like, now it's the first time they recreated the Hulk, I'm like, oh my God, with all the special effects, it's gonna look awesome.
And, with Bana, right? Yeah. Eric Bana's. Yeah. They made it all bad. I know.
Yeah. And it's one thing I always liked about the X-Men and a lot of the Marvel comics was that there was some real life storylines being told, in this Marvel universe. There always seemed to be like a lot of cool storylines are connected. You find out like Havoc is Cyclops' brother, and you find I'm like, oh my God, like this is so well thought out. I'm like, all these guys are connected in one way or another. It's like, and now it's just, and like you said, there's something about the world we live in where I just feel like everything that I loved is just like ruined. Like everything I grew up loving, the music that I loved, that I thought was really, anti-establishment and was anti, just going against the grain, and they danced to their own tune and their own beat. And now I sound like I'm singing that song, New Noise. Remember that band? Sing to the wrong, dance to the wrong beat, or how, I forget how it goes, but that was a badass song. They got kicked out of their country, refused. They're kind of like a punk kind of it's a great song called New Noise. Look it up, people. It's a classic. The band's called Refused, but they're very political too. But yeah, I mean, it's just like everything. It's weird, right? Because it's like now you're seeing things from a adult perspective, or a person who's been through or been down some rabbit holes. So now, like, your perspective on things, it's almost like it takes the enjoyment out of things. And this goes back to like the ignorance is bliss thing. It's like all these things I used to enjoy. Like if I don't, I can't unknow the things I know or unlearn the things I've learned, but now it's taken some of the joy out of that. And the other thing you were saying that I find really fascinating, and I'm constantly, battling with myself too. Like, the humans are emotional creatures, and there's no getting away from that. And I feel like some people who are too, like you said, like too mathematic, too logical, they almost dismiss emotions. They dismiss it like like, oh, those are just emotional creatures. Like, no, you're one of them. You are also an emotional creature. You just tend to believe that your emotions are having zero effect on you. Maybe it's having less effect on you, but it's having some effect on you. And then you go in the other direction where, like, you get the people who have, logic goes completely out the window, and everything is about emotions. It's like, well, I feel like I'm a man even though I was born a woman, or I feel like I'm a tree even though I was born a man. Like, whatever it may be, like all the craziness that's going on in the world. And it's like it almost gives too much value to emotions, and it's like, okay, like there has to be some middle. And that's like one of the most important things we should be teaching to young people. It's like, yes, emotions have some value because it's something that we deal with every day, every decision we make, every path we pursue and we go down is maybe influenced in some way or another by the way we feel about things. And but yet you can't blindly follow those emotions down roads, dead end roads, or you're gonna end up losing all logic and not really thinking out anything. You're just gonna, emotions are pretty. I mean, you, hormones, emotions. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that can just drive us in a certain direction, like, blur our vision.
Yeah.
When people say, "Oh, like, oh, we're far removed from our primitive ancestors," I'm like, have you ever been at last call at a club or a bar? I'm like, it looks like a bunch of monkeys looking for, somebody to reproduce with. It's like everybody's just like hammered, and guys are just like, just looking for somebody who, like, who they can bring home. And it's like, I'm like, we're still we're still driven by these things, these internal things, and you can't avoid it. But we've gone, we've gone so far in the other direction where I'm just like, Jesus, like, no, you should not have a litter box in school just because you think you're a cat. Like, you should, like, you hear stories like this, like, what is going on right now? Do you have any kids, Matt, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I don't. I don't. I've got a cat. He thinks he's a cat. He can use his litter box. That's it.
Okay.
I'm not gonna put him in the stroller though.
Yeah,
How
well,
about yourself?
that's yeah, I have two little ones. I have a 7-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. And yeah, I mean, the one conversation you constantly have with people is like, oh my God, like, like the world that they're living in and the world that they're growing up in. And it's like, how do you stop them from not TikToking and becoming wanting to get more likes on Instagram or whatever? It's like we are literally living in a social experiment. It's like we don't know what type of psychological damage is going to be caused by all this, social media, and then all the social engineering that's going on with Google and YouTube and all, like you said, there's all this subconscious um desire controlling agendas. It's like there years ago, and actually, speaking of Canadians, and I'm sure you're familiar with the documentary The Corporation. It was a great documentary. I forget who I had on from the documentary, so some representative from the film, and it really kind of went into how marketing and companies and corporations, it's, when they look at how to get, and this goes, obviously you're familiar with Edward Bernays and that type of stuff, but a lot of people don't realize, like, a lot of our decision making is subconscious. A lot of methods and ways to get us to like something or dislike something or want something or not want something is subconscious. It's not right up front. It's not like, hey, buy our product. It's like indirectly getting you to want their product, and they find clever ways of doing it, and they hire the best scientists and psychologists and all, so it's almost a unfair battle. Sometimes I tell other parents that they're, oh, my kid can't stop playing Fortnite. I'm like, Fortnite was designed for your kid to not be able to stop playing it. I'm like, Doritos was designed for your kid not to be able to only eat one and have to eat the whole bag. Like, these aren't, like, it's almost a unfair fight, because I'm like, you have, tons of money in research and development, tons of money in trying to figure out, the right texture of the Dorito, the right lights or music in the video game, how to get these serotonin dumps in your child's brain, so, and then they want to keep playing. And it's like it's scary. So, a lot of parents are just like, oh my God. But then I always try to remind myself, I'm like, people had kids during World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, when Genghis Khan was taking over, much of the world, people were having kids. So it's like, we've lived through some crazy times. And I always say, I'm like, if normal, logical, decent people aren't having kids, the shitheads aren't stopping having kids. So we're going to be outnumbered. So maybe you should have a child if you're a decent, logical person. Because if you stop, then it's like the future really seems dark and dreaded. But it's yeah. I mean, is that something you think about, not having kids? Like you not having any kids? Do you think about, like, oh, if one day I do want to have kids, like, what freaking world am I going to bring them into?
Oh yeah, no, it's a big thought. And my wife and I have talked about this quite a bit. She herself is also, I'm fortunate that she has also, she's a writer with me at Strategic Culture. She's the co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. And she's done some incredible original research as well into history and the growth of fascism and things like that. It's crazy. So I'm lucky that I have a collaborator in that sense with her. It's very rare, and I'm grateful. But yeah, we've talked about it, and we're very concerned about that. And we have many friends who have families, little kids. We talk to them a lot about what are they doing, what are they thinking. And sure enough, I mean, I think all parents right now who have half a brain are very, very concerned by the fact that a lot of the influences that are shaping the souls of their kids are increasingly far removed from their from the parents. There's so much that you're like up against a giant evil machine that intends to really enslave the next generation. Especially, they put a lot of effort on that. The homeschooling phenomenon has been a huge explosion. There's like a homeschooling renaissance that's been going on for the past couple of years for obvious reasons. And I've encountered some of the brightest young people who have written to me. Some of them participate in, I host weekly study groups going through original writings of Plato. Right now, we're actually working through something by LaRouche. Before that, we were working through some material by Lincoln and Henry C. Carey, his economic advisor in the 19th century. Just talking, like a lot of these groups that just, we're stopping, talking, asking questions, very interactive. And so a couple of young people, one's 17, one just turned 18, super sharp, both homeschooling. And I get a lot of feedback from parents who are doing this and working in networks, sharing what works, what doesn't work, and trying to create little mini cultures that can reinforce each other, because it's hard to do this by yourself as a family in this age. So that I'm seeing as a big part of the solution at the moment, at least, until the institutions can be transformed to serve the interests of humankind, which I believe inevitably they have to. Like, the idea of having educational or institutional education should never be a bad thing. It should be a blessing to be able to have quality education for everyone. But again, whenever this system becomes co-opted by a death cult, as ours happens to be, then everything will become instrumentalized to advance the agenda of that thing, that parasite. So probably the thing that matters most is the spiritual inoculation, right? Not the physical, but the spiritual inoculation, which is to as much as possible. All we can do, like the kid has free will, right? They have the right to make decisions on their own. They have the right to make mistakes, and the best we can do is provide to them the seeds and the that we can plant that will hopefully blossom when they will make mistakes, and hopefully be able to realize that the advice given to them out of love, maybe they resented it, but it was there for a reason, and become better for it. Also, I think giving the kids access to or a taste of good culture, listening to some of the more difficult music, but that's more subtle and longer lasting in terms of like deeper value, like listening to things like Mozart's Requiem or learning an instrument or things like that. It again, it reinforces the soul to sort of have a standard of like excellence in culture that it could then use as a reference point to see mediocrity. Because if you only know mediocrity, how do if you've only known Big Macs, how do you appreciate a high quality piece of cuisine? You can't do it. You might not even want to eat that thing with like broccoli on it and stuff. But if you've had good quality, healthy, tasty cuisine, and you contrast that with a McNugget, like prefer the good thing. But so that I think all good aesthetical pleasure, which is tied to a pursuit of wisdom and higher beauty, always takes it's always an acquired set of senses. They don't come just right off the cuff. They require sort of maturation of the senses, and that takes time. It takes work, and it's like that. But that's the way you can only play, like with the guitar, right? Like you can play around, you could improvise with the guitar, you could probably like riff with your friends, I'm sure, because you've like worked on your technique. But if you just skipped all of that arduous work of like building your technique, building a sense of the modes, the melodies, the harmonies, right? If you skip all of that, you don't really have the liberty to play around in a creative way as much. You're just sort of making a mess of sound on the guitar. But you can like work with other people who so you have to have a platform that you've built, an infrastructure in your heart upon which true creative play that's bountiful or useful can happen. And you don't get that in the arts. Like when I was studying fine arts, there was a real attack on that. Like especially in the fine arts programs, it was everywhere, where there was this sense that just expressing yourself is what is of primary importance, regardless of if you have nothing to say. And I would say no. Express yourself when you have something you want to get out of you. Like don't skip steps. Don't just like express yourself because you're like, I'm feeling depressed, so I'm gonna like do this thing with my hand paints just because I feel depressed. I want that feeling to come out. It's like try to have a more advanced feeling tied to maybe something intelligible, and try to figure out a way to draw it out, make a metaphor, make something that can be that can have intelligibility, I guess is one way to say it. Whereas like a lot of the postmodernist artists who took over all of the education system that I know of in the arts, especially in the fine arts world, and also atonalism in music, the breaking down of all structures of melody into like just randomized tones that replicate basically chaos in its most like randomized state. They have that with painters too. There's so many painters, but pretty much most contemporary modernist or abstract painters do this too. But the teachers in the program that I was in were all promoting the same idea that if you are trying to communicate something which is intelligible, you're doing it wrong. That's not art. Art is only when you can make your audience squirm uncomfortably, then you have art. But it's like, maybe I'm just making somebody as like anxiety ridden as I am. That's not good. Like that's not making, like, is that what art's supposed to, is art supposed to be a reflection of ugliness and like have my inner ugliness awaken in the ugliness inside of somebody else? That's just going to make the world kind of like worse. Maybe I could actually pull people out of the mud with something beautiful as well, using ugliness. Maybe ugliness can't be disassociated from it, but maybe it doesn't have to just be like, make you squirm.
Well, I would almost argue that art shouldn't, you shouldn't even think about the way people are going to perceive it at all. Like it should be just completely, because a lot of the best art in in my opinion, especially in music, but in other types of arts also, they're motivated by it's almost therapy. It's like the only purpose the only reason they're doing it is for some type of what it's the only way they know how to deal with whatever pain or trauma or whatever they're dealing.
Spiritual healing, right, in some form or another.
Yeah, so it's the best. Growing up, I would always listen to super depressing music or dark music or whatever it may be, and people are like, oh, why would you listen to that? It would only make me more depressed. I'm like, no, because I'm like, it's a soundtrack to the way I feel right now. So it's like it's letting me know that somebody else has felt this way, has been to these dark places, have had these dark thoughts and emotions before, and and this sound, this dark music.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
It's kind of this soundtrack. It sounds like what I feel. So like I remember when I'm sure you're familiar with Slipknot, when Slipknot first came out, right? And their first album was was amazing. I mean, I remember being a kid and I'm just like, what the? I'm like, 9 people all wearing masks, 3 drummers. What the fuck is going on here? I'm like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And then you listen to it. One thing I loved, and I don't think they ever captured it again in any of their future albums. I'm sure there's some people out there who might disagree with me, but and I think some of the reason is because they say musicians will say you spend your whole life writing your first album and then you spend 12 months writing your next album. It's like, your first album is like, it starts in your brain, right? I want to start a band. I want it to sound like this. You have all these ideas just kind of circulating in your head. And then, so it's like, all these amazing years of coming up with like ideas of like what you want to sound like and, all this stuff. And then you finally, put it together. And then you're kind of, have to hit fast forward and try to recreate that again, much quicker once you actually get signed. But the first Slipknot album was just like, it sounded like you were inside the brain of like a psychopath. Like if you took, you at your most depressed moment, at your most angry, emotional, darkest moment in your life, and if you turn that and made music out of it in some way, converted emotion into music, that's what it sounded like. And that's what made it beautiful. It sounded like, the darkness to it all, same thing with like some of the other darker artists, 9 Inch Nails back in the day, same thing. I had a very like, they were kind of the more mainstream industrial artists, Trent Reznor, but it was very like dark and just noises and and I like that part of some art. I think like most things, like we're talking about, finding this balance between logic and emotions. I think with art, it's very similar where like I like the idea of pushing the boundaries. Like there's this industrial artist called The Author and the Punisher, something like that. It's this guy, he makes all his own like musical instruments. Are barely instruments. They're like, this guy's like a engineer who just creates this just crazy. The sounds are insane. He's playing stuff like this, like like and like it makes you. One thing I always liked about industrial was it made you rethink what is music. Like, why does music have to be KMFDM back in the day, Gravity Kills, Stabbing Westward's early stuff. Like it was a lot of like, and then you go back to like Skinny Puppy, Ministry, like any of these artists were just like, what is music? Why does music have to be a guitar, a bass, and a drum? Like, why can't it be a sound? Why can't it be a tone? Why can't it be, and it kind of reminded me of like almost philosophy, right? Like philosophy, it's like, we're questioning everything. We're questioning reality. We're questioning morals. We're questioning there's so many different interpretations of stuff. Philosophy is full of questions and very little answers, right? It's just endless amounts, which why I always found it fascinating was like, it wasn't somebody telling me what to think, or it's not somebody telling me the answer. It's more like somebody, like you were saying, you're writing down the question, and the question was more fascinating than the answer. It's like, oh yeah, why is that? Why can't we see things like this? Oh, there's this person who's looking at it in this perspective. I've never even thought about it that way. It's like I've had another Canadian, Michael Millerman, on my show. Are you familiar with Michael Millerman? He is well, his claim to fame was kind of like he was the first person to translate Alexander Dugin's books to English, and he's in Canada. He got basically in trouble in his university he was working at because he was translating these books, and then now he has Miller, I think, the Millerman School, his own online courses or whatnot. But when I find somebody like Michael Millerman, and I'm like, oh my God, his way of thinking, is the way he describes Leo Strauss and gets into like his thinking and mystics, the way he talks. Like I love anybody who just shatters my worldview. And I know earlier we were talking about how there's this emotional reaction to certain topics. And I think when you talk about things like 9/11 or COVID or vaccines or whatever it may be, any of these topics that come with this emotional response, some of that emotional response is because you just shattered somebody's worldview. They're like, okay, I was told this is the way the world works, and you just threw me a freaking curveball where now like everything I thought I understood and knew could potentially be wrong. So your first reaction is like emotional, but yeah, to get back to the art thing, it's I see both perspectives where like, and then modern art takes it too far where it's all about like, oh, let me just throw some paint on this white piece of paper, and because I was angry when I threw it, and I can come up with some ridiculous story,
Intellectualized, justification
exactly.
for it after the fact. Well, I think there's always, like, again, it's all about harmony and balance in visual and in any type of medium of expression. Harmony always has to play a role, and it's a difficult concept for some people because it's not material. Like, harmony sort of means a fitting together in some way. It doesn't have to mean everything has to be. It's tied to the other idea of balance. That there's a mean between extremes, the emotions and the logic. Neither one of which we are. Like, a lot of people start, they think that they are their emotions. You hurt their feelings, they don't like you because whatever you said hurt their feelings, or you say something that offends their logical construct and they don't like you. And you're like, well, no, it's not you. I like you. This idea I find to be wrong, a lie perhaps that maybe you believe in. And so it's like, no, because if you think about your thoughts, the very act of self-reflection changes in some way the coloring of the thought, or the value of that the thought has on you. If you think about your emotions, sometimes, we feel the wrong thing. We feel jealousy when it's not merited, and just by taking a step back and evaluating the feeling changes the feeling. We're like, oh yeah, you could think about it like, oh, I guess I really shouldn't have really had a reason to feel that. And you could, but then the question is, well, what is self-reflecting? What is the you that is looking upon your thoughts and your emotions and passing judgment and helping you? How are you helping you, right? And you got this whole idea of, like, from Plato, know thyself, right? Before going off into philosophy, one shouldn't skip steps. And Socrates, Plato, would always make the point that the true philosopher isn't just somebody who speaks well or says they have wisdom, but it's the lover of wisdom, the philosophia, right? The philia, love, wisdom, the lover of the wisdom. And to do that well, you have to know yourself, self-examine. And I think, if you look at case studies of art throughout the ages and cultures, you'll find some examples of various art forms of different media, including literature and theater and other things, that will enhance an audience's capability of doing that, and other types of art that inhibit, that reduce our power of looking and self-examining and judging, because you don't just judge the same way over time, right? Ideally, if you're living your life well, hopefully your power of judgment is improving, right? Your power of passing judgment on the good and the bad is getting better. It'll never be perfect, but hopefully it's getting better and not getting worse. If it's getting worse, you're doing something wrong. So the question then, in my mind, is like, well, art is something that is created by humans of all types of art. It must have some purpose as far as the human condition. And you alluded to the question of spiritual healing. And I think that, if you, Edgar Allan Poe is a great example for me of somebody who a lot of people who think on a somewhat shallow level, they see the surface appearance of some of what Edgar Allan Poe does in his short stories, or some of his stories that are dark. and they just think, what a dark freak, right? That could write such things. How disturbing that he gets you into the mind of these sociopathic individuals who kill for no reason and seem to self-destruct, right? And it's like, he must be really sick that he can do that, and he gets his audience to do that too. And it's like, well, wait a minute, what's he actually doing there, you know? And he's not having you lose yourself and become like, I mean, there's some things where like you don't lose who you are in living vicariously through a story into the mind of like somebody in the Telltale Heart who just kills that old guy just because he could get away with it. Or what is the other one? Like the Imp of the Perverse, right? The guy who commits the perfect crime and then has a breakdown in public 2 years later. And now he's like, you discover at the very end of the story that he's actually this guy who's been recounting to you all this. He's actually about to get executed by the law, like in a couple of seconds, you know. And he's like, but they've lied to themselves. He's taking through the mind of somebody who doesn't know themselves, who has told themselves, all of these characters give themselves false narratives that cause them to be blind to themselves. And the consequence of being blind to yourself and going out into the world to do action causes destruction to others and to yourself. It's a great recipe for becoming a slave to an oligarch, really. And he gets you into the mindset of like even oligarchs. Like look at the fall of the House of Usher, right? It's a story of this pathetic oligarch, this multi-generational Roderick Usher, baron. He loves creativity, or he yearns to be creative, but he can't be creative. He lives in a castle, and he has like all of these dreams of romanticism of the medieval days when his great grandparents were at the worshipped by the plebes and the peasants, and he's like, those were the good times. We have to bring that back. And he's just depressed because he feels it's not going to come back. And his buddy, who was a friend when they were kids, who's like an American, and he like wrote him a letter saying, I'm really depressed. Come help me out. And the American comes back and he's like, what the hell? This guy's a mess. And the story is just Edgar Allan Poe taking you through the psychological profile of the patheticness of an oligarch who's trapped by their family heritage, who can't break from their traditions that are obsolete or had never had a place to begin with, and ultimately self-destructs. That castle doesn't do well. It eats him up. And so the oligarchy didn't like Poe for that reason. I mean, anybody who says he died of like natural causes, or even just that he was like got drunk and just died, no, he had high level enemies. But so I mean, the thing is, I think using darkness, and Poe writes about his philosophy of art, or his poetic principle, his philosophy of composition. And he writes that the most powerful emotion for the artist to cultivate is melancholy. And melancholy is a mixed emotion because it's both sadness and beauty at the same time, which seem logically to be opposing ideas or opposing states, but that in a melancholy state are united. And I think a lot of the music, especially for those who are processing trauma that they don't fully understand, or they're processing ugliness that they don't understand because we live in a very ugly world, right? It's going to naturally be, the more we're expected to adapt to that world, the more, if we're holding on to our conscience in some way, we're not going to react well. Like it's so an important part of that process is to appreciate darkness, to appreciate the melancholy emotion, the sadness, but also that's tied to a beauty of something that's missing, right? To appreciate or awaken the hunger for the good, while you are also experiencing the absence of it. And tragedy does it too. Like if you look at a lot of Shakespeare's dramas, especially his tragedies, and the best tragedians are able to sort of tap into this, is you get a sense that all of this stuff that's happening to Hamlet on the stage isn't necessary. He could have a much more positive, different outcome where the bad guys on the stage actually get their comeuppance, and things could end well. If he was only more self-aware of himself and what was really motivating him. But his own ignorance is causing him to make these terrible, insane leaps of folly into self-destruction, and including the people that he actually does love and care about. Ophelia and others end up suffering and dying, and you walk out of that experience, it's jarring. You're like, fuck, it could have been different, and that absence is sort of like tied to, I think, a hunger for justice. You walk out on the one hand more self-aware of like the little inner Hamlet, because these are like archetypes, right? Like Hamlet or Macbeth or any of these characters are often exhibiting certain universal archetypes of jealousy, prejudice, assumptions that all men have. Women have their own archetypes and assumptions, and they're playing out on the stage. And because they're universal, you sort of can see that, okay, I got a little bit of this in me. You can become more self-aware when you're about to make a Hamlet-like decision into something stupid. And one of the best pieces of advice that anybody could probably get is try not to do anything stupid. Like try to minimize your stupid acts and thoughts as much as you can. And you do that best by increasing your powers of wisdom, of judgment, and self-reflection, self-examination. So if art can do that in any way, any amplitude in music or whatever good. If it inhibits that, and some art is actually designed as, last thing I'll say here, William Sargent, leading Tavistock psychiatrist, worked with Bertrand Russell and Aldous Huxley. He did work on tribal cultures, going through trances, hypnotic states in Africa and Haiti, around the world. And he produced a book called On the Battle of the Mind that became an organizing manual for leading social engineers, including Bertrand Russell was a promoter of this when he talked about, tones repetitively repeated can really induce, especially young people, if you get them young enough below the age of 8 or 9, to believe in pretty much that snow is black. And these are people who were part of networks that were bringing online things that became trance music. If you look at like the phenomenon of how people lose themselves in Beatlemania, it wasn't like the Beatles were that amazing necessarily. There was this entire military, industrial, political, intelligence, psychiatric apparatus associated with selecting that group. And I'm not saying they didn't have talent. I'm not saying that, but and marketing it with a certain desired effect and outcome that they wanted to have within the population. And they did it in politics too, with Trudeau-mania in Canada. Like they used the same model that they honed under Beatlemania. They did it to Trudeau-mania, and they discovered that, hey, it works for politics too. We could have young women in 17, 18, like, wetting their panties over like some, fugly like guy, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, just because we marketed it a certain way. But again, like the work that people like William Sargent did and others on trances, on transformation within tribal cultures, they industrialized that as far as like cultural warfare dynamics that really targeted the baby boomers, those born after World War II, as like the malleable target generation as a zeitgeist. They got really hit hard, so hard. So a lot of the things we take for granted because we're like now a few decades into it, we're like, oh yeah, of course, these things are just classics. Bang Bang Maxwell's Silver Hammer, that's a classic. It's like, no, that's a sociopathic, crazy song. Like that's murderous. Or listen to some of the lyrics that are put out by Jimi Hendrix and others. Like, I mean, he's a good guy, he's talented, but like, look at the lyrics. Like that's some crazy shit. Like that's just psychedelic, Strawberry Fields Forever or whatever. I mean, like they didn't just emerge naturally, is what I'm just trying to say. There are agendas, and so yeah, we got to make sure that art, I think, in my mind, in some way. I'm not saying people can't listen to the Beatles and become better. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you can't listen to Hendrix and become better, and it might be what you need. I'm just saying that art should, in some way, the best art can enhance your ability to be a human and be a problem solver in the world, right? To be what a human is designed to be in some way.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, it's so, and speaking of art, you did reference that you have a book coming out. So for before, and so I want people to know all the social media. I know you're on Twitter and you have a website. Please let everybody know how they can keep up with your work, what platforms you're on, any upcoming projects like your new book. How do they, get notified when it is released and available, and anything else?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. All right. Self promo. So the book is going to be a while. So I'm aiming for January. Most of it's written, and it's going to be volume 4 of The Clash of the Two Americas. Volume 1 to 3 are obviously already out. This one's going to be more on the British roots of the deep state. So, what is the British Empire that you never realized it was? Because even the British Empire that still exists today is not what you thought it was. Because the British Empire wasn't what you thought it was. Britain itself was taken over by a parasite back in 1688, and that was itself part of like a 200-year effort to take over the British Isles by this thing. What was that parasite? How was it located formerly in Venice? How was Venice selected as the place that became the central command structure of what the Roman oligarchy, where they relocated primarily and reconstituted themselves after Rome collapsed, and the leading families being the same thing. So this fourth book will sort of try to shed light on some of that history and look at a little bit more of like where its weak spots, where the Achilles heels in the beast. Like, for example, what has worked to diminish their stranglehold over the system that they've wished to control over the centuries. My wife actually just this week, 2 days ago, just published her first book called, so I'll plug that too. You might even want to talk to her in the coming weeks. But her first book is out on The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set, on Anglo-American foreign policy and the creation of fascism in the 20th century. It's hardcore. It really goes into like the even 19th century roundtable Fabian society roots of what shaped the thing that became known as Hitler, Mussolini, other things through British intelligence. Also gets into some of the radical Islamic stuff, a lot of the Zionist stuff, like a lot of the things that are recipes for disaster in our current day are not organically occurring phenomenon, but are the effect of political agendas. And so she goes through a lot of those causal stories. And to pick up any of these things, they can go to canadianpatriot.org, canadianpatriot.org, or risingtidefoundation.net is our other website. That's a lot of stuff right there. Yeah, I'll stop there.
And you're also on Twitter, I believe, right?
I do a little bit of Twitter posting. I'm not too, I get too sucked into it and waste too much time. So I just go on, I post things, maybe like a thing or two, and then I leave. I have to cut myself off. But yeah, Twitter, I don't even know what my handle is, but you could probably just plug my name in, Matthew Ehret, and find me. Telegram, t.me/Canadian Patriot Press that's where I'm more active on Telegram. And Substack is the bread and butter. So if people want to get a free Substack, hey, yeah, screen share. That's my thing. Okay, there we are. Okay, yep. So that's the Twitter account, and the Substack is right there under my Twitter handle. There is matthewehret.substack.com. There's free and there's paid. Yeah, that's good too.
Yeah, thank God for Substack. I actually started, well, not just started, some months ago, started posting my podcasts on Substack too. It's just a great place. I'm like, anybody who's giving writers a platform and a ability to, monetize if they want to, God bless them, because, PayPal, Patreon, everybody's been kind of, just deleting people, censoring people or whatnot. And same thing with Rockfin. Rockfin was awesome because during 2020, they're one of the first platforms that really reached out to people in the alternative media community. And they're like, hey, you know what, we'll give you a platform where you're not going to get censored and you can monetize. And, our options were shrinking and shrinking. So, places like Substack and Rockfin, I'm always a big fan of supporting those platforms. So yeah, I'll put links to all this stuff in the show description. I'll have to also contact you in regards to maybe getting your wife on and talking about her book. That sounds very interesting. And I guess Corbett and I were wrong. You can make a marriage work if you're both going down these rabbit holes together.
It's tough. I mean, it has its own challenges associated with it. But it could work. Yeah, it's possible.
And yeah, and thank you so much for the discussion. I'll have to get you on a future Union of the Wanted episode too. I don't know if you've checked out any of those, but they're super fun. We get just a bunch of thinkers and researchers and authors and people together, and we kind of just bounce ideas off each other and talk about whatever. Sometimes we do shows specifically on a topic, and then sometimes we just kind of bring a bunch of different people on and we just riff on whatever people want to talk about, and it's always fun. And
it's soul food, man. Yeah, no, honestly, Ricky, yeah, anytime, just say the word, I'll be there.
I will. Yeah, I'll let you know. I think we have the next one. We do it every other Monday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. We we live stream on Rockfin, but and then the audio is available everywhere within a day or two, and the video is typically available within later in the week on Odyssey for free. So but I think the next one is next Monday, so I'll double check and see what the guys want to do, and what we're doing for topics, or if we're even doing a topic. We're just going to do a big discussion, and I'll keep you in the loop. I'll send you an email to remind you, and
if they say okay, my Monday is open, just so you know. But let me know if not in the future down the line.
Yeah. Well, when it gets too close to the date, it gets hard to kind of gather, a giant guest list for one specific topic. So sometimes I like, okay, we don't have anything in mind, and let's just do an open discussion, because, like we said in the beginning of the show, like there's never a lack of things to discuss. So it's not like we're gonna be like, oh, what are we gonna talk about? We got people, we have nothing to talk about. No, that never happens. So
it's a big mind. Yeah.
So, but
All
but
right, cool.
thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Amazing work. I always love hearing you on all the shows. That's why I'm like, I got to get Matt on. I'm like, he's such an interesting thinker and speaker, and I love just getting anybody who's thought provoking on the show, and you're definitely that. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll keep in touch. I'll send you links to the show once it's up and live, and like I said, hopefully we definitely talk again in the near future.
I hope so. All right, bye, Ricky.
Thanks, Matt. Take care.
See ya.